Dewar Gully. She is the co-founder and co-CEO at Title Equality and co-creator of a powerful new action-oriented methodology called the Equity Sequence. Title works with companies around the world who are serious about solving the problems of inequality in innovative new ways. Prior to founding Title Equality with co-founder Dr. Kristen Leash, Anna spent over 15 years in large, complex organizations and system leading strategies, transformation initiatives, and policy change. She has a lifelong passion for equity issues and a deep desire to help build a more just and equitable world. With that, I will pass it over to Anna. So thank you all so much for joining us.
Good afternoon, everybody, and I'm sorry about the technical challenges. I think we've lost a good chunk of our audience, and hopefully some of those folks will come back. I'm just going to start sharing my screen now. Abby, you can let me know if it all looks good to you. All good? Abby?
Sorry, we can't see your screen yet.
You can't see my screen yet. Me and Airmeet are not getting along. Is that okay?
No, I'm still just seeing you. So if you go to the bottom, present to audience, are you clicking share screen there?
I've clicked it. Now it looks like it's doing something before it wasn't. Hang on.
There we go. Now we're all good.
Beauty.
You're all set.
Okay, well, let's get through this, and I'm going to have to speak quickly in order to get through all of it. I'm going to talk to you all today about why the future of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion is about revolutionizing decision-making. My name is Anna Dewar Gully, co-founder, co-CEO at Title Equality. I want to start with a quick Indigenous land acknowledgement. I'm going to really move quickly to the reconciliation part of the acknowledgement and ask you in support to consider a regular donation in support of Indian Residential School Survivors Society, which I know is the beneficiary of ticket sales for this lovely event today. Very quickly about Title Equality, we help organizations build equity in radically new ways. We have a pretty amazing team of people who are totally and utterly passionate about the problem of inequality and how to find new ways to bring equity into organizations and systems. And we have partners and clients all over the world. I want to start by bringing you into that problem that my team is concerned most with, and that's the problem of inequality. And I want to talk about what is in terms of that problem. So today, inequality is really, it's one of the greatest problems of our time, and whole societies, whole organizations, innumerable people suffer from it. And the problem, unfortunately, replicates itself again and again because the system of inequality has a very strong pull. And today, too many decisions continue to be made by a homogenous few for a very diverse many. So that's the not so good news about the reality that we live in today. But I want you to also come with me into a vision for what I think could be in our world. I want organizations everywhere, systems everywhere to begin to see inequality as a solvable problem, not an intractable problem, as so many people continue to think of inequality as just a reality, when in reality, I believe inequality is solvable. And in order to solve it, we need to really be getting a true diversity of citizens, governments, employees, organizations, activated and engaged to spot problems of inequality and to transform them systematically and systemically. And in order to do that, I think we need to democratize decision-making in lots of new ways and ultimately build more equitable products, services, solutions, policies, designs, organizations, and ultimately societies. For the purpose of the conversation today, I want to zoom into the problem of inequality as it tends to show up in organizations and systems. Wherever you work today, I don't know what kind of organizations you're in, but I can imagine that you've seen various forms of inequality in your lives, in your careers, in organizations. It could look like unequal chances to advance and shape strategy. It could look like pay gaps, representation gaps, missing voices. It could look like toxic cultures, dangerous power dynamics. From an outside the business or organization perspective, it could look like underserved or undervalued markets, services that exclude certain populations or individuals. It could look like micro or macro aggressions and discrimination, things like racism, sexism, ableism, homophobia, transphobia, classism, and more. Many of these realities being determined by race, by gender, by ethnicity, sexuality, disability status, age, class, etc. So I'm going to ask Abby to pull up the poll. And I'm going to ask you to contribute your thoughts on, number one, how you're feeling today about the pace of change on equity issues and the problem of inequality in your organization. So I hope you can see the poll options now. And Abby is going to share those results with me. Maybe we'll come back to the poll results at the end. Abby, I don't know if you can jump back on screen. Many organizations are trying to take action on justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, especially after the year that was 2020 and 2021, with the horrendous murder of George Floyd, which I think catalyzed social movements around the world, with the inequities that have come out of the pandemic itself, and just the elevated conversation around these issues all over the world over the last couple of years has meant that most organizations are trying to do something about the problem of inequity or inequality. There are many ideas and initiatives taking root in many workplaces, and they kind of have a similar shape. If you were to look around the world's organizations today at what organizations are doing kind of in the main in terms of these issues, you would see most commonly diversity training. So things like unconscious bias training, cultural competence training. You'll also see organizations that try to celebrate cultural celebrations from a diversity of employees and their backgrounds. You'll see organizations trying to capture representation metrics. So in some circumstances, that may look like gender pay statistics, that may look like who is represented from a group identity perspective at various places in an organization. And many organizations today also have what some call an employee resource group, other organizations call an affinity group, and sometimes it's just a committee of people getting together to talk about issues of diversity and inclusion. Those are by and large the most common examples of the diversity initiatives that live in organizations. And as a student of social change and a person that deeply cares about inequality, and as a person that's worked in organizations my whole career and for a very long time now, because I'm not so young anymore, I think it's time to ask. I think all of us need to be asking how effectively these common interventions are, how effectively they're tackling the problem of inequality. Are they really tackling the problem of inequality at all? And I'm going to make an argument for you today, and it's one that I kind of hope will rattle around in your brains a little bit, and you'll think about as you move through your work. Maybe your work touches on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Maybe you're just in an organization that is trying to address these issues. So I would love you to think about whether you can see a broken bridge between the diversity initiatives that are happening in your organization and the ways in which your organization is making its most important decisions. It's my belief that in organizations all over the world, there is a broken bridge between diversity initiatives and decision making, and it's a bridge that we need to mend. And to understand why there is a broken bridge, I think we need to better understand the problem of bias, because bias is at the root of all inequality. I'd love to know your ideas. What do you know about bias? And I'd love for you to drop your ideas in the chat. Unfortunately, something about the tech setup for me today is not allowing me to see the chat. So I'm going to come back to some of your ideas a little bit later when I open it up for questions and close my presentation down. But please drop, just take a minute or two and drop whatever you know about bias in the chat for me. So I'm gonna tell you a couple things about bias. Some of these things you may know already, and some of them may be new to you. So I want you to think of biases as the shortcuts that our brains take to make it possible to make fast decisions and judgments. Interestingly, biases, we often, in the context of 2021, we think of bias as being an inherently pernicious or bad thing. The kind of moral failings that lead to problems like racism and sexism, et cetera. But the reality is that every single one of us has bias, and none of us are able to fully rid ourselves of bias. They're not all bad. Some biases lead to pernicious and discriminatory behavior, and other biases just kind of help us navigate complexity. And they're really part of our evolutionary biology. And I want you to just take a look at this really interesting codex of bias. And I want you to interpret from this that the bias that we all have in our brains is exceptionally complex, right? We have so many different permutations of bias in our brains. And so, in many ways, the diversity initiatives and the trainings that many of us may have participated in the past have given us what I think is a false impression that we have the ability to really effectively intercept bias when we learn that we have it. So the idea that knowing leads to doing better is, in this context, in the context of the way our brains actually work, is a flawed idea. And it's an idea that is at kind of the root of the theory of change of many of the diversity initiatives that we have going on in organizations all over the world. What I want you to sit with instead is that it's a fact that we all have bias. And so if we're going to contend with bias and the problems that bias cause for individuals, for groups, in terms of the bigger problem of inequality, we need to acknowledge how bias actually operates and think about how we can intercept it. And the reason for that is that this whole system of inequality is made up of millions of decisions, large and small, some being made today, some generations ago, out of decisions made by all of us. And we're all biased. So, when you live in an unequal society, and our biases are shaped by that unequal society, all of us are at risk of contributing to the problem of inequality and to either perpetuating it or to intercepting it and deconstructing it. So I'm going to just take a couple of examples and to try to draw a line a little bit for you in terms of why I think this connection between understanding bias and decision making is so important. So I don't know how many of you have been watching the news over the last couple of weeks and the COP26 coverage, this huge environmental conference that's happening in Glasgow. And there was this big story earlier in the week regarding an Israeli minister's experience at the entry point. This minister is in a wheelchair, and really unfortunately, she was prevented from entering the COP26 conference. And it was really an embarrassing situation for the COP26 organizers, and I think a horrendously embarrassing and really just awful experience for Minister El-Harar from Israel. And so I want you to consider, that someone's decisions, not necessarily just an individual's decisions, but probably a group of individuals' decisions, led to Minister El-Harar being excluded from COP26 because they did not design an equitable event and experience. They did not design an accessible experience. Another example of decisions contributing to inequality, I don't know how many of you remember this horrendous situation with H&M. This was such an impactful scenario for H&M that it actually closed down their entire South African operations. Basically, H&M created a campaign with a Black boy in a coolest monkey in the jungle sweatshirt. And it was just all over the world. It lit up the internet in terms of it just being an unbelievably racist and thoughtless campaign. And, again, I want you to think about someone or a group of someone's made decisions that led to a Black boy modeling a monkey sweatshirt for H&M without understanding the connotations or the impact of that decision. And then finally, one that's a gender-based example. In the UK, I don't know if you've heard about the criticism that the Home Office has been receiving recently. There were a spate of sexual violence attacks on women on London streets. It became, a very hot button issue in the news. And, the Home Office started to make recommendations about how to address this problem of sexual and physical violence that had escalated against women on the streets of London. And the recommendation was that women need to kind of keep themselves off the street, And so this was met with a huge outcry over, women being told to restrict their movements instead of people that are perpetrating violence being restricted. And this is an issue that in gender politics has been, a dialogue for many, many decades. So again, I want you to think about someone or a group of someones who made that call that a good solution to violence against women on London streets would be restricting women's activities. What all of those examples, I hope, will show you is that, it's not necessarily one individual's bias that contributes to the problem of inequality. It's actually many different people's bias that can contribute to the experiences that make someone have an unequal experience, a racist experience, a sexist experience, a homophobic experience out there in the world, in our organizations, or in terms of interacting with our products or services. And I want you to think about bias the way that Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman, who actually helped to coin the term cognitive bias, helped me to understand it. And that is to think about bias as a cognitive flaw. And it's a cognitive flaw that we all have, and one that unfortunately we don't have the capability to intercept very effectively. And I want you to think, and this is something I always like people to remember, is that frankly, while many of us will walk around the world thinking we are rational beings, we're rational actors, we're making good, we're making moral decisions. And we may look over to the left at someone else that's sitting at the table with us, at the boardroom table, for example, or someone else that we work with, and we might think, well, they're biased and we're not biased. But what I want you to understand is that we are all irrational, because all of us are biased, which means all of us are susceptible to those cognitive flaws. And those cognitive flaws, they catch us up in certain moments more than others, in particular when we're making fast decisions, and in particular when we're making decisions that affect other people that are different than us, that have different experiences, different needs, in which our own perspectives are simply insufficient to help us meet the needs of another individual, or, for example, to prevent harm of another individual. So we live in this unequal world. These inequalities seem to perpetuate themselves. Those inequalities shape our biases, and in turn, our biases shape our decisions. And we are just really poor at knowing that we're biased and intercepting the bias. Just, if you think about, like, I'm going to go into a meeting today and I know I have a bias against, older people because I've done an implicit bias association test. Let me remember not to behave in a biased way to those older people that are in that meeting. We're actually going to do a really poor job of that because the way that our bias operates is so much more complex than a simple issue. And so instead, where we can be better at intercepting bias is when we look at the product of our thinking in pieces of work, in decisions, in designs, etc. We have to ask ourselves, are those things biased? Because those things tend to be made not just by one person, but by many. And you can see bias a little bit more concretely when it's pinned down in the product of our work or our decision making. So I want to go back to that idea of the broken bridge. And I want you to think about the fact that I made this argument that there is a broken bridge between today's diversity initiatives and the decisions that our organizations make. And I want you to think about this guy. This is not a real guy, but this guy could exist in any of our organizations. His name is Dave. He's a communications executive. He's just participated in an individual focused diversity training, like unconscious bias training. And he's walked out, and this is based on what evidence shows tends to happen in a session like that. And Dave wonders, now what? He wants to know how he can put his learning about bias into action. Because we are more likely to believe that someone else is more biased than us, he recognizes that his colleagues are biased. He noticed that in the session, that his colleagues have biased behaviors and they're making decisions that might be biased, but he doesn't necessarily recognize that in himself, despite learning that he may have some bias. And he's noticed that there's some backlash amongst the colleagues who are most oppositional to progress on these issues. So bottom line, this training has not worked. And the example of what's happening in Dave's mind post an individual focused bias training is actually, it's rooted in the evidence about what doesn't work about individual focused interventions like unconscious bias training or cultural competency training. So I want you to consider why this approach failed to help Dave and his team. Number one, it failed because it's focused on the individual, not the system. So it's the idea in an unconscious bias training program, for example, is likely to be that Dave is biased versus that there are biases in Dave's work. And so while Dave may be able to work on some element of his thinking or kind of acknowledge his thinking, his biases are translating to his work. And instead of focusing on his work, where his bias could live on in an organization for a very long time, we're focused on Dave changing his mind. And so that's one reason it's not helpful. It's also been shown to deepen stereotypes and lead to the justification of bias, which is kind of a counterintuitive finding. And when you tell people that they're biased, it can create resistance or backlash, especially amongst people who are less interested in making progressive change. We need new interventions that focus on the system, not the individual, and target decision-making and problem solving. And we need new interventions that spark curiosity, invite new voices and perspectives, and empathy. Because one of the things that research has shown is that it's really actually, it's not possible for one person to hold the experience or understanding or awareness for an entire diverse population. You need to elicit and find perspectives that are different than your own in order to serve needs that are different than your own. Otherwise, you can perpetuate bias just by virtue of your own vantage point on the world. And the other thing is what I mentioned before, which is that we need a way to slow down our thinking because we tend to be more susceptible to bias when we're thinking quickly. And what I want you to take away from this, bottom line, is that all of us, every single one of us, is at risk of contributing to the problem of inequality through our everyday decision making. And I want you to think about the fact that to spot the problem of bias in our decision making, we need to focus our attention on decisions, and we need to slow down our thinking to gain new perspectives and to spot bias in action. And that's why we invented this system called the equity sequence that Abby mentioned at the beginning. And it's an evidence-based system made up of 5 questions that anyone can apply. I'll come back to the definition of equity, that anyone can apply to any decision. So, you walk into a room today and you have to design a communication strategy that needs to serve a broad audience. You could use equity sequence to consider whether there's bias in that set of messages that you're working on. And you can also figure out from using equity sequence what perspectives were missing from your design process and from the ultimate message that you created. It does all of the things that many interventions do not do. So it focuses on the system and how bias is creeping into our system versus the individual. It targets decision-making, it sparks curiosity, and it is a practice, something that you can use every day if you wanted to make your decisions more equitable. And importantly, it builds that bridge between equitable intent and decision-making. The reality is in all of our organizations, if you look around the world, if you look at who's on the board, who's in senior leadership, who's making critical decisions, we have too many homogenous groups of people with too many shared experiences, backgrounds, and biases making decisions, which means those homogenous groups are very likely perpetuating and sometimes expanding the problem of inequality. Thinking about equity sequence and why it's useful is that it helps you understand why having that homogeneous set of perspectives and why missing critical perspectives, exactly how that is contributing to the problem of inequality so that you can disrupt that by inviting new perspectives to your decision-making table and solve for inequality. Equity sequence we created really to help you be the change that you wish to see. So there are 2 easy ways to learn it if you're interested in it and learning this methodology that will help you blend or connect the dots between your desire to build a more equitable organization or world and the decisions that you make every day in your work. The first is that on November 18th, we're starting a 3-part live series, small cohort group. It's going to be really cool. You can find information about that on Eventbrite. And we also always make our learning available direct to consumer on the Title Equality platform, and that's at quest.titleequality.com. So I'm just going to pull out now and ask questions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Yes. So Anna, with your poll earlier in your presentation, we were evenly split between we're doing okay and we're moving too slowly. So I'd like to kick it off with what do you think is holding back the pace of change on equity, diversity, and inclusion work generally in organizations?
Yeah, so I think what's holding it back is that broken bridge. I think we have many interventions in organizations that are focused entirely around individual identity versus and individual biases versus how those biases are creeping into systems, and intercepting that. So, if you think about, for example, the fact that in the US, the largest intervention on diversity and inclusion, the most common intervention is unconscious bias training. It's a $10 billion industry in the US alone. You could go into an unconscious bias training session today, and there's nothing wrong with learning about your bias. It's great to learn about your bias, but you don't walk out of there with any actions or tools that help you bridge that knowing and turn it into doing, to changing your system, which means, you could have made a decision. Let's say you were designing a criteria set for a job and you designed it 5 years ago before you ever took that unconscious bias training, and you had bias that got built right into that process, and you've been using that same criteria set for the better part of 5 years. You going on an unconscious bias training doesn't solve that problem. You looking at that criteria set with a bunch of people from a variety of different perspectives who can spot bias that you can't see because of the limits of your own vantage point, so that you can transform that criteria set for greater equity, that really does change people's experiences, and it changes the outcome much more quickly than focusing on each individual within a system. And so I would say that there is an overabundance of interventions focused on the individual, and there is an absolute dearth of interventions that focus on the system. And I think that in and of itself is massively holding back the pace of change. It gives us the illusion that we're doing something when we're really not actually changing very much.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Great. Does anybody else have a question? If you'd like to raise your hand, I can bring you up on stage if you'd like to join us. All right, I don't see any hands, and I'm going to assume that you are all fervently typing your questions. But I do have another question for you, Anna. So you've mentioned that the focus on individuals versus changing the system is kind of where a lot of that gap is, and where existing trainings are not really doing us a service.
Mm.
But how can individuals and organizations target their decision making to build greater equity and equality?
So one of the easiest ways to do it is to use a technique that's called perspective taking. And the reason the equity sequence is effective is because it harnesses perspective taking as an idea. So perspective taking is as simple as it sounds. So you, Abby, working in whatever job you work in whatever sector you work in, with whatever background, lived experiences, you can only see the world really very effectively from your own vantage point, right? And your perspectives, as wonderful and moral as they may be, are not sufficient to spot bias in your work. And so one of the most important things that you can do is simply ask yourself the question, how is bias showing up in my work? Just kind of acknowledging the fact that all of us have it, therefore it's definitely creeping into our work. You don't know exactly how. And to stop yourself, slow down your thinking and consider, is there bias in what I just produced? And if I can't answer that question, can I invite people that have different perspectives, different lived experiences, different ideas about bias and inequality into this conversation with me to help me see things I can't see because of my bias, right? So perspective taking is like the single most important thing you can do from a systems perspective. And you could do that if you're working on a communication, a policy, a dialogue of some kind, the design of an event. You take that example of the minister that was left out of COP26 because it wasn't accessible. You can pretty much guarantee there were no people in wheelchairs sitting around the table designing that session, because if there had been, they might have seen that there were no accessibility solutions built into the design of the session. But because nobody in that room of decision makers brought that vantage point to the table, that bias was not spotted. It was not seen until it was too late, right? So it's thinking about bias differently. It's getting a little bit more curious and a little bit more creative about how it shows up. Instead of feeling like it's a wrong thing inherently, you have to think of it more as a fact of our existence in our life, and something that we all have a duty to root out. I see a question now.
Great. Yes. So from Donna, how can you influence your homogenous leaders and executives to be willing to recognize that they do have bias and that bias is negatively impacting the entire company? It's a big question. And
Mm.
we have listening functions in place, but they aren't truly hearing what's being said.
Yeah, so this is such an important problem, and this is one of the reasons that individual focused interventions fail. So I want you to imagine that, you're talking to a person that is really quite regressive to change. And you send that person through an individual focused training, and you spot bias. They take an implicit bias test, they see that they have bias, but this is a person that's resistant to the idea of that. The reality of what happens to a person like that when you're training them on an individual basis is they cross their arms, they roll their eyes, and they step back, and they do not engage, right? And that's shown on a statistical level in terms of impact studies on unconscious bias training. However, if you can take it out of the context of them, so it's not about Dave, it's about Dave's work. And Dave's work is not just about Dave. Dave's work probably had 10 people involved in it before it left, before it became a decision or a thing or a design or a process. Equity sequence helps you take it out of the individual focus into the thing and say, for example, was this thing designed with equity in mind? And one of the things you start to realize is most things are not designed with equity in mind. Most things are designed by too homogenous group of people. So the most important thing to help Dave realize is that his own vantage point is insufficient, right? It's not as important to help Dave understand exactly what his bias is. What's important to teach Dave is that bias is a reality for all of us. You can't kind of rationalize your way out of bias. And therefore, there may be inadvertent cognitive errors or flaws creeping into his work that'll create, a reduction in effectiveness, fail to reach audiences that need to be reached, et cetera. And so it's about trying to persuade Dave, and the equity sequence helps you do that in a really practical way, helping show Dave that by not having those different perspectives at the table, you run the risk of not being able to serve your target market, serve the full diversity of your employees, et cetera. You start to see in real time the consequences of those limited perspectives. So I tend to think that it's about inviting folks to see that you can't possibly be truly representative as a single individual, and to focus the conversation there versus on to start with, especially with the resistant population, to start with that, and from a place of curiosity about what perspectives we're missing from the table. That in and of itself will start people on a journey to educating themselves about the consequences of their bias. But I sometimes think dealing with resistance, you have to go at it from an angle instead of head on in order to help people start to have the problem reveal itself to them without resistance, if that makes sense.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Anna. That was a really insightful presentation. I'm definitely walking away with a lot of thoughts about what I can do in my own work to try and spot my bias, and starting to think of people who I can lean on to help me spot my own biases. So
Awesome.
thank you all so much for joining us, and we hope you enjoy the rest of the sessions this afternoon.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
All
Thank
right.
you for listening, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.